In this lesson, we're going to essentially cover how we can debug our code by using breakpoints, watchers, and stepping through our code and resuming our code execution to allow our code to stop at specific places where we can check variable values, watch those variable values, and see what's happening in our code to determine if there's any bugs. So there are many ways we can go about setting breakpoints. And what we want to do is add a couple breakpoints to our code. So let's select the line we'd like to add a breakpoint on, which here is in Password Data Editor, line 205. Let's right-click and add Toggle Breakpoint. Now note it's Control-Shift-B or Command-Shift-B on the Mac. So select the next line as well and hit Control-Shift-B or Command-Shift-B and see that that does indeed toggle the breakpoint. Additionally, if we go to the Run menu, we can see that we can toggle the breakpoint here as well. So let's go ahead and add that breakpoint back in. And now let's switch to the debug mode, where we're going to be debugging our code and make sure that we have our debug ready to go and we can see our code in more detail. So what we can do now that we have these breakpoints in place is we can actually execute the code and watch as this code stops when we hit them. So let's run the program and debug. And then we have to hit the password data in order to hit a line. And there we see that we've hit our first line of code that has a breakpoint on it. So now the code execution is stopped. You can see the program doesn't do anything until we go forward. And essentially, we can examine what these variables are. You can see them up here in the window. You can see this is the P variable with object 1 and object 2 being Hotmail and the Hotmail password. And we'll definitely be setting those, but we want to see this happen. So what we want to do is watch as this line of code executes. The next thing that's going to happen is we need to do p.getFirstObject. So if we go to the Run menu, we'll note that step into is F5. And so we're going to go ahead and do that. We'll hit F5 here. And what that will do is get us to our first object, return this.01. We'll hit F5, and now we're back to textKey.setText, basically that first object we retrieved, .toString. So now we have to run toString and the setText methods, which we don't necessarily want to watch. So we're actually going to skip over these at this point. And to do that, we're going to run the step over operation, or F6. So when we hit that, we skip directly to the next line. Now text key is set, but we can't necessarily see what the value is. And we want to make sure that the value was actually set to the first object that we were expecting. So what we're going to do is add a watch to the text key. So we highlight it and right-click and select Watch. And we see that that brings up text key. But as we look through this, we'll see that the value, and I'm doing this quickly just to save time, you can do it more slowly, the value is not shown. And so what we need to do is actually add a new expression here, textKey.getText. Now when I do that, that's going to show us what's actually in the text property of that text key. And so that watcher will be available to us as we continue to step through, and we can do the same thing for text value. Now the other thing we might have been able to do is run an inspect on it, and here you can see a little bit more, but again, it's a JText field and has all this information and not necessarily giving us the value that we're looking for. So now that we're on our second one, again, we can hit F5 to step into and see that this is going to get our O2 object as expected. Hit F5 again. Now we're going to have the same toString and setText. If you continue to hit F5, you'll see what I mean, but basically I'm skipping that. We're going to hit F6 and just go to the next step. And again, we don't see exactly what text value is, so let's add a new expression here, textValue.getText. So we can simply see, make sure that those values are set as we're expecting them to be. So the next thing I want to show you is that you can actually enable or disable a breakpoint. If you right-click on it, you can disable the breakpoint, and of course it won't hit anymore until we re-enable that. And there's another thing that we can do. We can actually set a conditional breakpoint. We can go to Breakpoint Properties, and in our Breakpoint Properties, we can select Conditional, and we can add in an expression here, such as value of this equals something else, and it will only suspend when that evaluates to true, or we can make it so that it suspends when the value changes. Now that's useful so that we can skip over breakpoints, especially if you're doing an iteration and you want to skip to maybe the 50th iteration. You could run a conditional breakpoint and do that. And so basically, once we've gotten to that point and we want to continue our code, we know we've stepped through everything that we want to do. The last thing we want to look at is just stepping over and resuming, and basically that's going to be done hitting the resume command or the F8. And you can note that this button also over here is going to resume. So if we hit that, we go through and now our code is up and completed. So that won't stop again until we call for a new password. So we hit next. Once again, our code has hit a breakpoint. And note the values are still the old values until we've stepped over them and reset these values. And so here if I hit F6, F6, and now I'm going to hit F8, you can see now that that is done, we're on our Gmail. And so essentially, that wraps up our look at adding breakpoints onto our code, stepping through our code using F5 and F6 and F8, and adding watchers and seeing the different types of breakpoints we can actually toggle and use on our code.